Bobi Wine Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert avudde mu mbeera maaso ku maaso n'alangira Pulezidenti wa America Joe Biden obunnanfuusi enkwe n'obutaagaliza Africa okubanga y'omu n'eggwanga lye erya America abasibye bannakyemalira mu Africa babawagira babawa buli ekyetaagisa ne balemera kuba na Africa n'egaana okulaakulana lwakuba bo balina ebigendererwa ebyabwe bye byetaaga okulaakulanya amawanga gaabwe n'okuzza Africa emabega.
Bobby, I would love to start with you to kickstart today's show. Unfortunately, I have to pose a difficult question too, because as you are aware, we are 10 days from the 2-year anniversary of a massacre in Uganda when regime operatives reportedly on the orders of President Museveni himself shot and killed over 150 of your fellow citizens in broad daylight. And despite these horrific crimes committed with absolute impunity, the US has remained one of Museveni's biggest diplomatic and financial backers. So in light of this reality, which has been, ongoing for decades, how do you assess the role of the US and Uganda? Is it helpful, or does it only worsen a situation seen by many Ugandans, by millions of Ugandans, as wholly intolerable? Would love your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and greetings to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here. Although I'm introduced as Bobi Wine, which I appreciate, Bobi Wine is just a nickname that is unfortunately overtaking my real name. My name is Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Mitembo, and I lead the National Unity Platform Party, but I like to also introduce myself as an artist and a common Ugandan. First of all, I want to appreciate the collaboration of the United States with Uganda, because it identifies us as a state that is worth associating with. However, the collaboration comes largely to the detriment of the people of Uganda, well knowing that the fact is that Uganda has been under the military dictatorship of General Yoweri Museveni for the last 36 years. For the last 36 years, Uganda has seen gross human rights abuses. Today, as we speak, abductions are the order of the day, and this is open. Torture is the order of the day, and this is open. The regime does not hide it anymore. Unfortunately, even though every once in a while we get strong statements from the United States, those statements have become more or less cliche. The United States supports the Ugandan military with approximately $1 billion annually. Never mind the fact that it is open that the Ugandan military is culpable for gross human rights abuses. It is heading the Ugandan military and police is heading the list of gross human rights abusers. The United States continue to sponsor that. Why do I say the US continues to sponsor that? Because they know what exactly they are sponsoring. Many times we've raised our voices to the United States, asking them to make the respect of democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights preconditions for collaboration. It is sad that we have not had a strong response in terms of action, thereby, confirming that indeed the United States is in many ways sponsoring operation back home. Now, I'll close by saying that the United States, when you are introducing it, you introduce it as the world's greatest democracy. So isn't it hypocritical for the world's greatest democracy to be the biggest sponsor of the abuse of democracy in Uganda? That's a question that I will leave to the United States, knowing that if America was led by a leader that will, be in power for 36 years, it probably would not be the great democracy, the great country that we all look up to. So the question is, does America want Uganda to be a democracy, a strong democracy like America, or do they still want us to just be as a pawn? As we discuss, maybe we'll attempt that. I thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Bobby. I like where you started because it leads me to the question I was going to follow up with, because you set basically a foundation that looks at what the US is doing now that is aggravating human rights violations, or somewhat showing that they could be doing more, but there is something that's not being done. So my question really is, looking at the future, what do you think the US could do to genuinely improve the situation in your country? If you had, for instance,
would you kindly start the question again?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so I was just alluding to the fact that you gave a good background of what the US is doing to contribute to the human rights situation in Uganda. And my follow-up question was going to center around looking at the future. What, in your view, is something that the US could do that could be helpful in improving the situation in your country? If you had a moment with the president, for instance, the president of America, the secretary of state, what would be your message to them?
In one statement, I would say, do not sponsor our oppression. Do not pay our oppressors, because Uganda largely depends on foreign aid, and the US being our biggest donor, they know what exactly they are sponsoring. We could write a whole book about that, but our request has been precise. Please make democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights preconditions for collaboration, because it shouldn't be charity, it's collaboration. These are a collaboration of equals. Let it be about the values that bring us together: democracy, respect for human rights, and the rule of law.
Thank you so much, Bobby. I think I'll bring in Kawala into the conversation, because as an advocate for human rights, you've also seen many occasions in which the United States has pushed hard to defend human rights and punish human rights violators. But you're also coming from a country where the US, along with others such as the EU and France, have formed long-standing partnerships with authoritarian incumbents and so become complicit in human rights violation. Do you see the US as a genuine partner, particularly looking at your country?
Hello, everyone. I'm also delighted to be a part of this conversation today. I think it's extremely timely as we kind of sit and wait for US midterm election results within the next couple of hours. Where we're going to find out whether the US itself is going to really remain a democracy. I think that this is a very interesting time, because the US is fighting for its own democracy right now. And I am maybe a little bit more jaded than Bobi Wine. I think one thing that's very important for us to realize as Africans is that there is no country that is promoting democracy in the world. There never has been. It does not exist. Countries promote their interests in relationships with other countries. And I think that what we need to discuss as Africans is, what are the interests that we have in common with the United States? Right now, we have in common the need for functional states in Africa. And I'm not talking about democracy. I am simply talking about a state that functions. So a state that is present, that is able to know its citizens, able to provide basic services, water, electricity, healthcare, education to its citizens, a state that is able to provide hope to its citizens. Hope means that citizens believe in this country's tomorrow. If you believe in your country's tomorrow, then you don't emigrate. You don't move to go to another country. You don't become an illegal immigrant across the Sahara, across the Mediterranean, through the South America to try to get to the US. The US has just dispersed in the last couple of months $1 billion to help Africa deal with food insecurity that is mainly due to climate change and conflict. Now, this disbursement is taking place because we have so many states in Africa that are simply unable and have actually become the causes of not adapting to climate change, the causes of conflict. Conflict in Africa is almost systematically a direct result of decades of bad governance. At a time when US interests are in the line of fighting for its global position as the world reconfigures itself. Right now, the US is trying to fight for its position in relationship to China and Asia as a whole, China and India, and in relationship to Russia. And as we see at this time, Africa is the partner that all of these big global powers are seeking. However, it is in the US's best interest that, one, we are functional, and two, we progressively eliminate autocracy in Africa, because these autocratic states are also by and large dysfunctional. So what should the US do in light of common interests, not in light of because they love us, they're going to promote democracy for us, but in light of common interests, which is that Africans should be able to take care of this one of the largest and youngest populations on the face of the earth, the US needs to rethink the way that it is partnering with Africa. One is that on the continental level, yes, the US should partner with Africa based on the shared principles and values that are in the African charters, the African Charter for Democracy and Good Governance, the African charters that all of our countries have signed up to. That should be the basis for cooperation. But within that continental approach, the US needs to distinguish on a country-by-country basis and based on the level of functionality of the state and autocracy in the state, needs to distinguish its approach. So you cannot have the same development policy for Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, or Uganda as you do for Botswana, for Mauritius, or even Ghana and Kenya. So you need to have a differentiated strategy. And in that differentiated strategy, in my opinion, the most important thing is not aid. While aid is important to many countries, I think the US plays a much bigger role in as the largest contributor to the international financial institutions. So while USAID is carrying out seminars for 50 people in Uganda on electoral voting rights, or how to get more women into an electoral process, which is not one to begin with, because we're talking about dictatorships. So while they're doing that through State Department and USAID and so on, they are at the same time contributing to the IMF, who will be loaning the loans of Cameroon, for example, at this time from the IMF is $900 million. This is after we have taken $300 million post-COVID, that the audit, the Cameroonian government's own audit, showed that the state stole 70 to 80% of that money. Then they turned around and went back to the IMF and renewed and got a $600 million loan. So to agree with Bobi Wine, basically what we're seeing here with aid and with the international financial institutions is the financing of autocracy and the financing of dysfunctionality, because this money is number one, it's a loan. And so it has to be paid back. But number two is that it is providing no services, and it is helping to keep autocracies in place. So just to conclude, with over close to 150 million people who are facing acute food insecurity. We have 36 million forcibly displaced people. We have debt, which is 58% of GDP across sub-Saharan Africa. We are faced with some of the biggest governance challenges on the globe. We need governments that are functional, that are competent, that are extremely creative and innovative to face this. And what we are getting instead is the US and a global international system that is supporting autocratic and dysfunctional governments. We can't continue this way. We need to completely rethink the way that the global institutions from the UN to the IMF are dealing with autocracies, and especially dysfunctional autocracies in Africa. And we need to do that. They need to rethink the system, but also engage, especially in autocracies, with non-state actors that are really, really important in redefining how we develop this relationship. Let me stop there.
Thanks so much, Ka, for that. And I'm really glad you brought up the issue of multilateral institutions. You know, you mentioned the IMF and the World Bank, you know, both of which often give huge loans to African countries, some that are far more lucrative than anything comparable to foreign aid. And you laid out some of those figures, but you also went into the issue of how these loans, of course, often prop up ruthless dictatorships. And, you know, we'd be remiss not to mention that the Biya regime in Cameroon, for example, just marked 40 years in power this past weekend. And we know that there will be US officials listening to the show today. We know that there will be folks from these global institutions. So I want to press you a bit more and just ask you directly, you know, what would your advice be to them on how to reconcile this very clearly dissonant reality, this issue of finance this situation, whether it's the role of the US in these multilateral institutions as the biggest donor to them, which you mentioned. What can concretely be done in a practical way moving forward to improve this situation?
You know, Jeff, it's surprising. What can be done? Apply the rules. Yeah. It is so outstanding to me that, you know, a country like Cameroon, like I said, we carried out an international campaign against the Cameroon getting new funds from the IMF after they had so mismanaged $300 million in COVID funds. So the audit showed that Cameroon was buying materials for COVID at 10 times the market price, right? The Ministry of Health. The audit showed that the Minister of Health gave, the Secretary General in the Ministry of Health gave contracts to his brother, who bears the exact same name as he does. The audit showed that they were, you know, giving contracts. Cameroon has a ceiling of about 100 million franc CFA, over which you cannot give contracts without bidding. So these guys were systematically giving contracts at 99 million franc CFA. The audit showed that companies that had been created in January 2021 One company got over 70% of the contracts. It was created in January 2021, had never done any business in Cameroon, and then all of a sudden was getting COVID funds, COVID contracts for over 100 million. So they violated every single rule of public finance management that you can think of, and some that you cannot imagine. And after this audit, after our campaign, we wrote to the IMF. We actually got a meeting with the IMF. After all of this evidence, the IMF turned around and gave Cameroon $600 million in a regular loan. There have been no repercussions for Cameroon. So what we were asking in our advocacy to the IMF was, don't give Cameroon any more money until they tell you what they're going to change in their public finance management system, because if things went so badly wrong, it means the system isn't working. So let's engage on a real reform process, and let's condition any new money on that reform. Number two, we said the people, the individuals are really well known. So don't give them any more money until these individuals are gone and have been replaced. Our third request was for the publishing of the audit, because at the time we were advocating, Cameroon had not officially published the audit. Well, we got 1 out of 3, the publishing of the audit. So they got new money without changing a single thing in the public financial management system. They got new money without firing a single person. All of the individuals who manage those COVID funds are still in their positions. So, it's amazing. It's not rocket science. It's not anything extraordinary. You and I cannot go to our banker and take a loan and completely mismanage the loan and then come back for more money. We can't do that. And so we're asking that basic, the most basic of rules be followed. This would be so huge in helping those of us in the countries who put our lives on the line to ask for accountability from our governments. If these international institutions were asking for minimal accountability, we would have much more functional states.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that valuable contribution, Kai. I really appreciate it. I want to shift gears a little bit here and bring Zachariah in. As a scholar, obviously, you look at the evidence in a balanced and systematic way. And as someone who has studied social movements, for example, across Africa, we thought you had a really unique vantage point to the issues we're discussing today. We wanted to talk a bit about your research and what you have found to be the most important ingredients for affecting real substantive change on the ground in terms of respect for human rights and holding leaders accountable. Some of the issues that Kai and Bobby before her were just discussing. Obviously, local agency and meeting the needs of local populations are paramount, but does the U.S. have a role to play here? And if so, how does official U.S. policy fit into this broader equation? We would love your thoughts on that.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with Kai and Bobby in particular. And I don't want to Sorry about that. So thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be on this panel. It's an honor to be with Kai and Bobby in particular. And I don't want to repeat too much of what they've already shared. I just would endorse a lot of the opinions that have already been expressed. What I would say as a scholar and as a U.S. citizen, I think a lot of the outrage that we have around the U.S.-Africa relationship is really a feature, not a bug, of the larger system of how foreign policy is made in the United States. If you actually look, there's a very interesting document called the Africa Strategy document that was released in August, and I revisited that ahead of our discussion today. And it's an extraordinary document in the sense that it suggests 3 pillars of U.S. policy towards Africa. And the one positive one, of course, is this desire to combat democratic backsliding, as it's referred to in the document. But it's sort of positioned alongside two other priorities, which is to expand trade opportunities with the continent, and then the third one, of course, to increase security partnerships. And so the question is, how do these three things fit together? And is there sort of, are they supposed to be sequential? Are they supposed to be co-equal? And I think what's very clear from this is that, they are actual priorities being listed, with democracy and democracy promotion being the least significant of this, right? So in my view, security becomes the premier concern, as Bobi was giving us the example of the Ugandan case. Trade is a close second, and any sort of effort to promote democracy is a distinct third in terms of US priorities. And you can tell this very clearly from the document, because the other thing that the document does very clearly is it lists China and Russia over 10 times in a relatively short 17-page document. And so throughout this document, which is really meant to be a guide for how the US engages with African countries, you can see over and over a very explicit appeal and effort to contrast the US as a good partner for African countries, in contrast to the Chinese and to the Russians. Right. And I don't think we have any desire here to defend or to romanticize what China and Russia are doing on the continent, but it's really striking that really the document's not about Africa at all. Right. Really, it just sort of positions African countries as part of this larger geopolitical competition, and suggests that Africans would be naive, ignorant, stupid, even if they didn't choose to partner with the US in favor of the Chinese or the Russians. And I want to suggest that it's not just the document that makes this position. If you look at what the US Congress has actually done, a few months ago, they passed the Countering Malign Russian Influence Activities in Africa bill. This is a really weird and strange piece of legislation that passed with overwhelming support from both Republicans and Democrats. The vote was actually 415 to 9 in the House, which is extraordinary in this era of supposed polarization in the United States. And it's basically, is the only real legislation that is passed around US-Africa foreign policy by the US Congress. And it has nothing to do with the interests of African countries, let alone African peoples. Right. It's really, again, a document that shows that the way that the US is conceptualizing our relationship to African countries is around these larger geopolitical competitions. And so it's no surprise, to come to your question, that by and large, the social movements that have exploded across Africa over the past decade, primarily led by young people, are not able to find much of a receptive audience in Washington. I mean, that in general, even where Washington is trying to, offer what I would consider to be primarily rhetorical support to pro-democracy forces in Africa, that this is often hollow support, providing some trainings, providing some funding to occasional figures who kind of rise to attention for various reasons, but no real effort to reevaluate the nature of our relationships with so many autocrats across the continent. No real effort to take any risks and to position ourselves as a true democratic champion in contrast to our Russian and Chinese rivals. And so unfortunately, I don't look at the United States, despite some nice people working at US, the National Democratic Institute and elsewhere, who I do believe mean well, that fundamentally I don't think that they are really going to have any larger influence in reshaping how the US understands African countries as primarily, junior partners in our larger security and economic objectives.
Thank you so much, Zakaria. I think one of the points that you mentioned, the idea that there's a lot of frustration around just the design, how the policy in the US is made. And this idea as well that because it's not necessarily a focus about or a focus on the interest of the African people, that's why you tend to see that the different changes in administration also in a lot of instances changes the interest on Africa. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have and why we're having this conversation today to say, how do we flip from the space that we're in, where we're constantly adjusting ourselves as a continent to fit into the strategies of the US administration, into a continent that is able to say, these are our priorities, this is what we want, and then the US and other players can actually fit into it. So I think that's very, very important. And then the one question I wanted to ask you, though, was just looking at the fact that there are important connections between Africa and America, both in terms of the diaspora, the flow of ideas and remittances, and in terms of the African American community as well, which has contributed a number of US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs over the years. So how do you think this can be harnessed to build a stronger and more effective relationship that represents a genuine partnership with respect for African agency?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a hugely important observation. If we look, sort of at the longer history of the relationship between diasporic Americans and African politics, we can see that Black Americans in particular have had a long history of championing African issues to the U.S. government and to international agencies. So if you go back to the anti-colonial struggles of the 1940s and 1950s, figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ralph Bunche and others were very prominent voices in U.S. foreign policy circles, pushing the United States to recognize liberation movements across the continent, and oftentimes were quite successful in those efforts. If we look at the anti-apartheid struggle of the 1980s and 1990s, again, it was a lot of organizations established by Black Americans who played this role in pushing the U.S. government, which was a close partner of the apartheid state, to abandon apartheid, and were ultimately successful in that regard. And I think, again, now with the sort of rise of African immigrant communities across the United States, I teach at the City University of New York, and the sheer number of students that I have who have roots on the continent has really brought a fresh infusion of potential voices to start lobbying the U.S. government. And unfortunately, I don't think those voices have really broken through quite yet, not certainly compared to these previous efforts to insert that diaspora into foreign policy discussions. And so what I would like to see a lot more of is better coordination. I think one thing that the earlier generations of Black Americans did well is to keep the focus on the big picture. Any individual African country is never going to be a priority for the U.S. government, but Africa as a whole is certainly something that is an important site for U.S. foreign policy going forward. And so more Pan-African solidarity to pressure the U.S. government to stop funding autocracies, to create more equitable economic policies. I think that is a better strategy than sort of trying to fight as individual countries and hoping that the U.S. might take notice. I think that, in general, there is a lot of individuals in the Biden administration, including the current U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, including many other figures who are Black Americans who have longstanding interests in Africa, who could be targeted with certain kinds of appeals to perhaps pressure the Biden administration to revamp its Africa policy. I mean, I think that the benign neglect and often detrimental approach that the U.S. has taken to Africa is not unique. That has been going on across Democratic and Republican administrations. And so, who knows what the future holds, but I do think the Biden administration, because it has a higher number of African Americans in government, might be a significant opportunity to start. I don't want to romanticize, the possibility of change, but to start to shift the perspective of how the U.S. government has been approaching Africa policy for too long now. And I think the diaspora will have a huge role to play in that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Zachariah. We're at the point now where we typically go to our discussion, but Ka, I see that you wanted to come in here and contribute something very quickly. So 1 minute, over to you.
Thank you. 1 minute. I just wanted to really reinforce what Zachariah is saying. One, that I think we need to be more cynical. I'm sorry. We need to, this idea that the U.S. is going to defend or look out for African interests is just, that's not the way the world works. And we should also be careful. Do we ask the US to look out for France's interests when they deal with France, or to look out for Germany's interests? I think that we as Africans need to understand what is our place, what is the strategic moment, and we can only succeed together. So bringing groups that are fighting, and we are in this moment where there's an explosion of groups on the ground that are fighting for African justice, African democracy, and so on. We need to talk to each other better. We need to build. I am always amazed that today, with the internet, with all the means we have, we are not as connected between Africa and the African American community as they were in the 60s, as they were in the fight for apartheid. We just wrote a book about women connecting across continents that's coming out next week. So I really think that, you know, this is where the key is, and that we need to stop with the, let's hope that America takes into account African interests. They're not going to. They don't, and is that their place? That's not their place. Africans need to take into account African interests, and we need to be at that table negotiating with all of our leverage for those interests.
Maybe if I could.
Yeah, Bobby, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I want to thank Ka for being straightforward, but that's typical of African women, very straightforward. I am personally struggling to be polite in my communication because I don't want to sound angry, but I'm actually angry. You know, I'm trying as much as possible to avoid words like hypocrisy, words like intellectual dishonesty. However, Ka represents me a great deal. We indeed are not asking the United States to save us. We are only saying, stop sponsoring our oppression. We are not asking you to come save us. We are trying to save ourselves, but we're being held back, you know, because we are trying to fight to save ourselves, but we cannot fight against the American dollars. We cannot fight against the American trained soldiers and the American weapons. I will also want to add a word too about the issue of interest. And Ka mentioned it. It's about interest. Unfortunately, these interests in many ways come off not as moral interests. Because the first interest that brings us together as international community is morality, moral interests. However, General Museveni, in our case, and just like many other dictators all over the world, particularly in Africa, have learned how to play the interests of the international community. For example, in the context of Uganda, when General Museveni is drawing closer to the Chinese and closer to the Russians, he plays a blackmail card. He blackmails the United States, and you will find the United States rushing to deal with General Museveni in order not him to go deal with China. In any case, China and in many ways Russia, you know, give aid, mainly military aid to Uganda without any condition. They don't put conditions of human rights. They don't put conditions of democracy because they're not democratic themselves. So that way, the United States seems to be falling in the trap. I want to believe that the United States knows exactly what they are doing. And it frustrates many democracy lovers to see that democracy and human rights is put on the periphery. This is just business. And I want to say that that is immoral. And also, the United States frustrates democracy lovers and lovers of institutions when they move on to deal with General Museveni as an individual. And I want to believe the same thing with other dictators like in Cameroon and others, you know, dealing with an individual, not a nation, that, you know, legitimizes the takeover of institutions here in Uganda. A few days ago, Uganda Ugandans were horrified by a statement that was made by the United States representative to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, that is the United States representative to the United States. She said a few days ago, and I quote, I want to quote, "We, the United States, still have a strong partnership with General Museveni. He has been and continues to be a strong leader in the region." Now, the United States, I wonder how it's going to explain to the world that it's not propping up strong men instead of strong institutions. So this comes at the backdrop of a rigged election. Last year, the United States Foreign Department issued a statement discrediting the 2021 presidential elections, where United States election observers were blocked from observing that election, an election that happened with a closed internet. I was the main challenger to General Museveni, but I was put under house arrest. My entire campaign team was arrested. Many of them are still languishing in military prison. Many people were massacred on the 18th and 19th of November 2020 during the campaign. Just a few days from now, we're going to be, observing the second anniversary of that mass murder. Unfortunately, with all that, the United States tends to continue hobnobbing with the dictatorship. So I want to conclude by saying that the United States looks really with a tainted image, hobnobbing with a known dictator, and yet it is known as the world's greatest democracy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bobby, for speaking up and speaking your truth, and certainly to Ka and to Zachariah as well. I think, obviously, we've talked a lot today about the evident disparity between rhetoric and reality in terms of U.S. foreign policy, particularly as it pertains to Africa, which is a very good segue to today's discussant with Elizabeth Shackelford, who wrote an entire book on this subject. So you're not the only ones who are frustrated. You have many frustrated people within the U.S. government as well. So with that said, I'm going to turn the stage over to our colleague Nick Cheeseman and to Lizzie, today's discussant, to get their respective reactions to the show and the contributions thus far, and mainly to address the questions, many of them, which came through our WhatsApp and on our social media pages over the past few days, including today. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And as always, a massive pleasure to be on the show with people like Bobby, Ka, and Zach. Great comments from everybody so far. Elizabeth, it's a real pleasure that we have you here. You are known, of course, not only as being someone who resigned in 2017 to call attention to the declining state of diplomacy under the Trump administration, but as Jeff said, for your fantastic book, The Dissent Channel, which won an award, and which I encourage everybody here to go out and get. Maybe Jeff can put a message out on Twitter after this of a link to the book, so people who hear you can follow it up. You will have heard many of the comments, but you'll also have a different perspective coming from someone who's been an insider. I'd love for your perspective back on what you've heard so far. For everybody else, just to say that Lizzie's going to give her feedback. I'll throw in a few comments. Then I'm going to read some of the many questions we've got from across the continent today. And I have to say, this has been one of the biggest responses we've ever had. For those in the meeting, I'm going to put them in the chat to give you an advance to have a look at the question I'm going to ask you before it comes up. So for the speakers, check out the chat for the question coming up. Lizzie, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, I'll start by saying I don't think that my perspective is that different from what we've heard today. As someone who was on the inside and watched a lot of these decisions being made, in real time, South Sudan was where I served and what I wrote most of my book about. But the challenge that we saw there over and over again was very much the same. The short-term focus on security, which ended up with a long-term cost to our own national security interests. I'm going to ring the bell that Ka said over and over again. You're not going to persuade the U.S. to do better by saying, help Africa better. I mean, that's not going to happen. All nations are out for their own selfish interests. And that's okay, because once again, Ka, I'm sorry, I'm just stealing everything from you, but what you said was great, which is, on these governments that are bad governments, autocratic governments, are bad for security. They're bad for long-term stability. They do not create good trade partners. They do not create reliable security partners in the end. We've seen this over and over again. I do think it's, as Bobby has gone over and over again with Uganda, it's a classic example of how the United States, for its own short-term national security interest, props up a bad government that creates a bad situation in that country. I think part of this is kind of natural. It's something that you have to overcome in a democracy, because any administration is going to be looking at their short-term interests. So you've got to find a way to change the paradigm so that the folks on the inside fully understand that the long-term interest of the United States with its relationship with different countries across the continent is not in having kind of hard-standing strong men and autocrats, but it's in having functional democratic governments that provide services, provide stability, and provide that hope that Ka was also talking about. The truth is, on the inside, in the National Security Council in the U.S., there is an understanding of this with the folks who cover Africa. But in this great wide world where the U.S. is overextended in a lot of places, those interests are often undermined by the bigger picture. You see that Africa strategy that came out. They basically did control, find, replace, counterterrorism with great power competition in order to try and make sure that it rose to the top of the queue, or at least somewhere in the queue of national security interests. But I would say we're not going to get this administration or the next administration to focus on all of the important long-term kind of generational change that needs to be done. So my personal thought, as someone who's been on the inside, is to focus on, much like what Bobby was saying, just stop doing the bad stuff. It's not necessarily, there's the sense that doing more is better in terms of the US relationship with Africa. If we pour more money into it, if we pour more soldiers into it, if we pour more, sell more weapons into it, that shows that we care more. But the real challenge is when what we're doing is actually undermining the long-term security in these places. So I would just leave with, I know we've got lots of questions to get to and a really great panel to answer them. So I'd just say two takeaways from me, which really do just mirror what we've heard from the other excellent panelists, which is, stop propping up dictators. You can make that case to the American people by talking about that $1 billion industry of what we pour into places like Uganda and the bad that it has done. Take it back to taxpayers. Just don't spend that money. How about we do less and focus on doing it with countries that are moving in the right direction? And always, make those arguments based on what's in the U.S. national security interest. Because, as much as we like to wax poetic on how much we care about democracy, at the end of the day, that is not what our policy decisions are made on.
Thanks so much. There's more food for thought there. I'm gonna try and throw in maybe one more critical thought, and maybe a more optimistic one, to see if we can get up to sort of thinking about what might be done in the future. We are coming up to a US-Africa summit. There might be some scope for moving things under the Biden administration, at least compared to where things were under the Trump administration. The more critical thought is that I think, the recent experience for many African citizens, commentators, and leaders of watching the West in Ukraine has been quite instructive and quite disappointing, in the sense that they've seen, perhaps for the first time, quite how effectively the international community can move in an emergency. And watching the West move like that for Ukraine and not for the famine, for example, in the Horn of Africa or West Africa, or for the multiple other conflicts taking place on the African continent, has been a good reminder that those things aren't happening, not because it's not possible, but because there's not the prioritization. And I think in some ways that's brought into sharp relief for a lot of people some of the hypocrisies and inequalities. Think about the large numbers of Ukrainian refugees accepted into the UK at the same time as we have a Home Secretary talking about invasions of people and trying to stop, desperately poor people crossing the channel in rubber dinghies. That contrast, that comparison, I think really brought out some of the issues that have come out today. The more optimistic, thought that I wanted to just fly was that, I don't think it's true that everything that's been done, has been problematic, or that everything that has been done has been unsuccessful. I think that the argument that we've heard, it's most, very persuasive, is first do no harm. And I think that's very powerful. But I think it is important to say that there have been some beneficial developments, right, that have been funded by the international community. The higher number of women in parliament, I think, has been an important campaign. Funnily enough, it's not something America or the UK has managed back home, but the support of donors for that has made a difference in a lot of African states. We can argue about whether or not that's substantive. We have seen, international community, for example, supporting judiciaries, and that has contributed, not the major factor, but it's contributed to the efforts of judges to break more judicial independence in countries like Kenya and Malawi, which has played an important role in those countries over the last few years. So I think it's important we don't completely throw out the baby with the bathwater. And we perhaps try and use the last 20 minutes, 30 minutes to think about more concrete recommendations that we can put forward, whilst absolutely taking on board what everybody has said and the cynicism that we've heard from all of our speakers so far. With that in mind, I'm going to ask your questions now. We'll go in the order in which you spoke. So Bobby, I'm coming to you first. Just for everybody, a reminder, they're in the chat if you want to check them out quickly. So Bobby, the question here is from someone who wants to know a little bit more about what Museveni does to make himself so attractive to America. I mean, what has he done over the past 20 years to get this kind of lock on international support, where, as you said, he can commit the most heinous human rights abuses and still remain a key partner? What is he doing? How is he doing it? Are others following suit? Asks a questioner on our WhatsApp.
Thank you very much. You will allow me answer the question in two ways. First, what he has been doing. I can be sure of what he has been doing and maybe suggest on what he is doing. What General Museveni has been doing for the last 36 years is painting a rosy picture of his rule and Uganda. He has been able to smartly deceive the international community. You will notice that President Bill Clinton back in the 90s described General Museveni as a new breed of leaders. 36 years in power, General Museveni has spent a lot of billions of taxpayers' money in Uganda, paying lobbyists in the international community, paying companies to paint a rosy picture of his rule. And yes, he has presented himself as a benevolent dictator, as a democrat. And part of our effort was to show, to unmask, to pull off the mask of General Museveni. When I ran for president last year, it's not that I was not aware of the situation. I was aware of the militarism, but because we knew that we had media on us, we wanted the international community to see what General Museveni is realistically. And we were able to show the world. The world can no longer pretend not to know what General Museveni is. The United States can no longer pretend not to know that they are propping up a tyrant. And we always have put a question that when Taylor did to the Liberians what General Museveni is doing to Ugandans, he was sanctioned. When Mugabe did what Museveni is doing, he was sanctioned. When Saddam Hussein did what General Museveni is doing, he was sanctioned. When Idi Amin did what General Museveni is doing, he was sanctioned. Why then General Museveni is not being sanctioned? We believe that the United States, in many ways, it's looking at interests. And many times they've pointed at security and the war against terrorism, which we agree with. But we have told them time and again that they should deal with the country, not an individual. They should deal with institutions, not an individual. So I can say that I know what General Museveni has been doing in the past, lying and deceiving, and painting a rosy picture of democracy and putting up fake elections to justify that we have democracy. But right now, just last year, the United States election observers were blocked from observing the elections. The United States knows that besides all the massacres that have been carried out, besides the Kasese massacre, just 2 years ago, just under 2 years ago, more than 150 innocent citizens were massacred on the street, and nothing has happened. So allow me to throw back the question on the table, what General Museveni is doing right, and also to ask that, is the international community, is the United States, enticed by evil? Is it enticed by violence? Is it trying to prove to us that we who are nonviolent cannot be supported, but those that are violent are supported? That's a question that I want to bounce back to you.
Thanks so much, Bobby. I think, my answer to this is partly what Lizzie put in the chat, which is, I think one of the things that, Museveni has been particularly good at is finding the one thing the West wants and giving it to them. At one point that was a development partner. It was somebody who would lead on HIV/AIDS. Then when that dried up, it was Ugandan troops in Somalia. He's consistently tried to find the one thing that could make him attractive to a Western audience. And I once wrote in my book, Democracy in Africa, that if there was ever a kind of world championships for manipulating the international community, Museveni would win the gold medal every time, because he finds that one thing. And it's no coincidence, right, that as soon as a leader starts to have some troubles with their allies internationally, Paul Kagame, they start throwing troops at peacekeeping operations and into other countries, because then they become indispensable. And all of a sudden they can treat their citizens back home however they want, but because they're supporting international, programs in other countries, all of a sudden they get a pass. And I've talked to people, who've been involved in the administration of many countries who, like Lizzie says, are desperately, trying to promote democracy, who have said to me, as soon as those troops went in, our ability to speak truth to power in that country went away. So I think you're absolutely right. But I think it's also, we also need to be clearer, I think, about how good some leaders are at manipulating international preoccupations and the things that Kara said to basically keep themselves in power. Now, Kara, we're coming to you now. The question for you was, are there any international donors out there doing a better job? We've been pretty tough on the United States tonight. Are there good examples? Is there anybody you see out there who is doing a good job? Is there anyone, Bobby, you can come in again on Uganda. Is there anyone on Uganda you see as being credible and consistent and pro-democratic? From your point of view, is there anyone in Cameroon that you see as being, credible? We talked about America, but of course, this is a big realm of international donors. Is there somebody else out there doing best practice that the US could follow?
So I'm also, I will get to that question, but I think that the undermining of democracy, rule of law, and and especially the fight of Africans on the ground for democracy in their countries is what is fundamentally wrong. You are doing harm. So, you gave an example, I think somebody in the chat gave the example about women. Well, if you have an autocratic government in place and it has more women in it, excuse me, I'm a feminist, I fight for women's rights, but Biya having more women who adhere to his philosophy of autocracy does absolutely nothing for me as a woman and does absolutely nothing for me in my country. And I think this is what is wrong with development cooperation, is that if you want to compromise, the fundamental foundation of a nation, because, yay, we trained 30 more women in entrepreneurship. You're compromising your own interests. And I think this is where, Lizzie really put the finger on it, which is how do we get administrations that are elected for 4 years and need to get results in 4 years to understand that the long-term interests of their countries are inextricably linked to our long-term interests. Yes, you send peacekeeping forces to support, whatever initiative is going on internationally, but your human rights violations, your lack of respect for rule of law is going to create the next security situation. And what's outstanding to me is that this has been happening for decades. The US supported Mobutu for how long? And almost the length of time they supported Mobutu is how long Congo has been one of the most conflict-ridden, basket cases for the world once Mobutu was gone. So it's like this stuff is, again, it's, if you look at it from an interest base, the interests of the West are, as a whole, and the US in particular, are in creating, in supporting, these fundamental pillars to functioning democratic societies in Africa. So yes, international donors, international aid as a whole on a micro level, there are a lot of amazing things that are done. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Even in the seminars for democracy, which I question quite a bit, there are things which are done in teaching. It is important to teach Cameroonians who've lived under 40 years of Biya, to remind them what rule of law is, to remind them what fundamental human rights are, because we forget. We live under oppression for so long that we forget, and we're not conscious of what our fundamental rights are anymore. So yes, those things are important. All the things which are being done in agriculture, in our entrepreneurship, with women, with young people, all of those things are really, really important. But if we don't get the fundamentals right, there's no place to put those things. There's no way that training the 50 entrepreneurs will impact Cameroon on scale if we do not get rule of law in Cameroon, and if we do not get a state that is, fundamentally concerned about its citizens enough to provide electricity, to provide water. How are you going to entrepreneur in a continent where, 1 out of every 2 people doesn't have access to electricity? So I think we have been, because the fundamentals are difficult, they are complex. Here we have not talked about the coup d'etats within the last couple of years in Africa, which are basically the result of the support both on our continent and globally because we have been supporting ignoring these rulers who changed the constitution to stay in power. We now have young people and armies who are like, you guys can't get rid of them? Well, we're going to get rid of them. We're going to get rid of them with a gun. And then now we have a real mess. Because that ruler is gone, but we've got guys with guns in charge of the country. So I think we're really at a crucial moment for Africa. We cannot do the surface stuff. We cannot be satisfied with these small little wins anymore. The continent is in serious trouble, and we need partners that will enable us to have leaders that are able to look at these fundamentals.
Thanks so much. And I think one of the things there, I just really want to echo, I saw Jeff actually punching the air in celebration when you hit some of those brilliant points. But one of the points, which I think we've tried to echo a lot on the Resistance Bureau, is that if you consistently prop up authoritarian leaders, you create the crisis that you think they're solving for you, right? You think that the big man is protecting you from unrest, from this, you think he's helping you with your foreign policy. You think he's helping you fight terrorism. But what you're doing is you're creating the next crisis. And you said that there beautifully in 2 different ways, both in terms of sort of long-term unrest and civil war and the context in Zaire, DRC, but also in terms of the coup. So I just think that's such a brilliant point. Bobby, did you want to come in there? Is there, on the point about it, is there anyone out there you think is doing a good job? I mean, Kaz made a great point there. Don't just do the small stuff. If you do lots of great small stuff and don't do the big stuff, the small stuff isn't going to help us. But is there anyone that you see internationally, that you think is a good example that people can follow?
You mean the leaders?
Internet, yeah, other donors, other different countries, different leaders who.
Without a doubt, the international donors are doing a great job. And I'll speak in the context of Uganda, where the government has completely failed to deliver services. It will be recalled that even the COVID-19 funds, the funds that were extended to Uganda to fight COVID-19, were all mismanaged. Today, the government of Uganda was told by the donor community that it's not going to be given cash, but it will be given utilities and the medicines and the things that are needed to fight Ebola-19. Unfortunately, the government of Uganda is still insisting they want cash. Why? Because cash is easy to mismanage, and that is what the Ugandan government is known for. We continue to appreciate the friends, the governments, and the donor community that continue to support the people of Uganda, the people of Africa, in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, and otherwise. Also, individuals like yourself, individuals like my brother Jeff Smith here, and all the friends of Africa that continue to raise our voices. I must say that our voices alone as Africans are not enough. In many ways, we try to be as polite as possible, but our friends, the sons and daughters of those developed countries, the great democracies, have actually gone a notch higher to call out those governments, which is the right thing to do. They are doing a good job. So, yeah, while those that are supposed to be doing the job are not doing it, those that are whose responsibility it is not are actually doing a good job, and we appreciate them. Of course, the citizens are doing a great job. They are paying a high price, arrests, brutalization, even death, but they are still standing strong. I cannot forget to give thanks to them. I also want to conclude by reiterating the question, but rather this time in the assertive. The question was more or less like, does the United States administration do more on democracy or do less by stepping aside and not propping up the tyrants? I would say that the United States can and should do more to defend democracy, because that's a value, that's what brings us together, to defend human rights. And I will note that here in the context of Uganda, a few years ago, the government of Uganda passed an anti-gay law, and the United States and all other international communities rose up in arms. They cut all the aid, they cut all collaboration with the government of Uganda until that law was, recalled. Now, this was a law that was against the minority, the rights of the minority, and the United States put its foot down. How about when the rights of the majority are being abused? I thought the United States is supposed to take the same stand or an even firmer stand. Unfortunately, it has not been the case. So I want to mention that the United States should do more in regards to defending democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. And yes, do less on propping up tyrants.
Thanks so much, Bobby. I got a question I'm going to put to Zach, and maybe I'll add a little bit and come back to you, Lizzie, quickly, and then we'll go back to Jeff and Taddy because we're running out of time. Zach, your question I put in the Q&A was about countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone, which seem to have been able to build a new future on the back of international support. And aren't there some examples that are a bit more positive that we can point to? But I also want to ask you and Lizzie a slightly different thing, which is, if you were in the US-Africa summit, one of the things, of course, about these summits is that none of us ever get invited. Maybe we shouldn't, but, it's a small number of African leaders who get called. You don't get opposition leaders at US leaders summits generally, or civil society, or commentators, or that many academics. But if you were in the room and you had an opportunity to say something, what is it that you would say to try and, inch that conversation forwards? I hear what both of you have said. Actually, the interests are so ingrained, the issues are so big that, radical change, I think you've both suggested, is, unfeasible, and we would be unwise to hope for it. But if we sort of think about inching towards something that looks like at least a more sophisticated, less objectionable, more consistent policy, what would you say in that room that you think might resonate with some of the people there in terms of being able to bring that about? So Zach, it's kind of two questions. You can answer whichever one you want. Lizzie, I'll come to you for that final part of that question, if that's okay, very quickly before we go back to Jeff and Mentali. Zach, over to you.
Sure. I would say that, let me try to answer both the questions at one time. And to start, let me say that I would throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right. I think that this sort of emphasis on small gains in terms of U.S. policy towards Africa, or the international community's policies towards Africa, is a big part of the problem. Right. It allows us to ignore the actual role that the U.S. plays in Africa, the actual role the international community plays in Africa. And it's a diversionary tactic that has been used for generations now in terms of how we deal with African countries, where we try to magnify these really, really tiny victories and pretend like they portend some larger, gains across the continent. And there are structural reasons to be very wary of these patterns. I mean, if Rwandan women, Rwanda has the largest number of female parliamentarians on the African continent, higher share than the United States. If Rwandan women, started protesting in the streets tomorrow, I don't doubt that Kagame would shoot them down. And I have no doubt that the U.S. would be muted in its response, right? So I'm not particularly impressed by these small gains. I think that Africans are demanding larger structural transformations, and I think the international community and the U.S. in particular is preventing them, right? So what sort of advice would I want to share with my own government invited to participate in this summit? As you point out, we are not, and maybe, perhaps I shouldn't be invited, but I think there are plenty of people who could be and should be. I know that folks in the African diaspora here in the United States have asked for the possibility of attending, and they've been denied. So I think it's a real problem that these voices are not being heard and are being systematically excluded. But what I would say is that I think we should learn from history, right? If we look at why the U.S. government has actually done things that have been beneficial for African countries, it is almost never because of moral considerations. This charge of hypocrisy that Bobi keeps bringing up, as much as I'm sympathetic to it, it simply does not work. The U.S. is fully aware that it is hypocritical when it comes to foreign policy. As a political scientist, I can tell you that being hypocritical is not exceptional. It is the norm in academia. We push governments, we mock governments that are not hypocritical. We say that they are naive, that they're ignorant, they don't understand national interests. So hypocrisy is the norm. It is expected, right? And the only thing that seems to work are moments where the U.S. government makes harsh and rational calculations that show that the current strategy is no longer working. And I do think in this particular moment, with the rise of China in particular, China is presenting African governments with an alternative. It is an alternative that I find problematic as well, but at the very minimum has the advantage of taking seriously the question of African sovereignty and insisting that anything that it does on the African continent will ensure that African sovereignty is always respected. This is deeply resonant for leaders in Africa. I think it's a big part of China's appeal to African governments. And frankly, I think China is winning in its capacity to win over these governments. The US is doing this summit next month, but it's nothing compared to the sort of continuous outreach that China does to African governments. And I think, if we look again back to the 1940s, with the rise of the Soviet Union, to the 1980s and 90s, with the fall of the Soviet Union, those were the kind of broad geopolitical moments that led to shifts in American policy, substantive shifts, where the U.S. started to, for example, the 1940s and 50s to push back against European imperialism, in the 1990s to push back against the apartheid state. And I think potentially with the rise of China in Africa, we may be entering a new era where government officials start to recognize that our current approach is failing. More and more African governments are turning towards China in particular, as well as other countries in Asia. And if we continue on our current path and don't reevaluate and come up with a new approach, we are going to lose Africa, just like we lost Latin America, and just like we continue to experience a waning of American influence globally. So that's what I would say is to put it into starkly power terms, rather than appealing to any sort of moral consciousness.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, right? And you play to the interest, and it's certainly clear that the US is losing traction. It's losing soft power globally by the day. So I think that threat, like you say, and actually playing to power interest rather than playing simply to altruism and the principle of democracy may well be a way to mobilize more people. And of course, not just in America, right? Exactly the same set of concerns that you just set out apply equally to the UK and other countries as well. Great. Thanks so much for those comments. Lizzie, we're going to come to you to wrap it up. Same question, if you will, and then we'll go back to Jeff and Mantadi because we're almost out of time.
All right, I'm going to pretend like you told me that I get to run the entire agenda for the US-Africa Summit. And if that were the case, what I would do, I would shift back to, and this falls perfectly in line with what everyone's been saying, but I think the right approach is we're going to focus on quality over quantity of relationships on the continent, not doing a bit of everything that's not very good everywhere, but we're going to work with the most promising countries that are meeting us on, in terms of these values, that are having that long-term security, stability process, that are moving in that direction. I think that, I don't think that I would recommend that we just pull out of everywhere else and kind of shut down our military engagement, our military partnerships and things like that overnight. But I think that you could say something at this summit like, we've got 3-year timeline, maybe 5-year timeline, but we are going to be rolling back with countries that do not move in that direction. And I think that there's some credibility in this administration having left Afghanistan. And I believe that the US pulling out of Afghanistan when it had, after many, many years, a government and a military that was not moving in that direction and not meeting US national security interests there. I think we've got more credibility about the idea that we actually are capable of wrapping things up that are not progressing and doing well. I could be wrong, but I think that that's a little bit of why what we've seen in Somalia is a bit of a shift with the government taking more of its own kind of direct engagement in the battle against al-Shabaab, because they realize maybe the US won't be here for 100 years. So I think that's what I do. I would give countries notice. It's not that we don't like you, it's that we have limited resources. So we're going to put our money where it's going to be the most effective, and our political support and our diplomatic support where it's going to be the most effective. Continue doing humanitarian support, continue doing, doing assistance to civil society organizations and human rights defenders. But I think that there really should be a shift where we're not trying to out-China China on every part of the continent, but we're going to try and have really high quality partnerships with countries that are going to work with us towards mutually beneficial ends. And that would be the approach that I would take.
I think that's a great point to end on, because, one of the things we've been emphasizing a lot in today's show is the power of the United States, for good or for ill. It's also important to remember that great empires and great colonial powers and great foreign powers often get a sense of hubris about their influence abroad. And at some point have to come to terms with the fact that they're not as powerful as they once were. That's certainly been the case for my country, the United Kingdom. I think the US has clearly been there for the last decade. And that kind of question of how do you come to terms of actually trying to do more, or the same amount, with actually an amount of money that is increasingly becoming marginal, relative to what every other donor is putting into their country. And as Kara said, compared to International Monetary Fund, World Bank, etc., making that consideration and coming to terms with your diminishing power in a multipolar world is something that I think is a really great point, and one that hopefully somebody will mention in the US-Africa Summit. So thanks so much, Lizzie, Zach, Bobby, brilliant show, lots of fantastic comments. I'm sending it back to Mantadi and Jeff to take us home.
Because there's so much that we've been learning. But as you've already said, that we do not have the time, so we have to bring the show to a close. A special shout out to our panel of experts for a job well done. Our team at the Resistance Bureau looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you and to highlighting the important work that you're doing moving forward. You inspire all of us, and thanks again for taking the time to be with us today. And of course, thank you so much to our audience for engaging with us and for tuning in. Please stay in touch with us between shows by visiting our website, www.theresistancebureau.com, and by subscribing on our homepage to get updates on the program, as well as to get our show summaries and participate.
Emboozi mugiwulidde bulungi, epadde ya kuteesa kulaba eggwanga lya Africa awamu literedde litya okwemalako oba okwejjako okwegobako bannakyemalira, nti eggwanga lya America n'abakulembeze baalyo be bamu era be basaale abalemeseza Africa emabega, nti bajja ne boogera ne beeteeka mu kiti ekimu naye ate nga bali mu kiti kirala. President wa National Unity Platform Bobi Wine Kyagulanyi Ssentamu ategeezezza nti akalulu akaali e Uganda, America ba observer bayo be yasindika, Mwai Museveni yabagaana okuobservinga akalulu, era ebyavaamu America n'ebigaana ng'eyita mu Secretary of State Anthony Blinken yategeeza nti akalulu tekaali free and fair era kyali kyakuswala. Tinaye ate waayita ebbanga ttono ate omuntu gwe badisqualifyinga nti teyayiseemu mateeka ya byebubbi ate ne batandika okwekubya naye ebifaananyi bwe baamuyita okugenda mu America ne bekubya naye ebifaananyi nga bamuyise nga president wa Uganda, naye nga kino bakikola mu interest zaabwe oba mu byetaago byabwe bo bye baagala ng'Abamerika ebibayamba ebitwala ensi yaabwe mu maaso, nti twagala Museveni atusindikireko abasirikale mu Somalia mu Al-Shabaab, twagala Museveni atugendereko atukolere kino na kino ABCD nga bibakolera. Kati in return bawongera kumuwa sente okuva mu IMF, World Bank, bongera kumuwa donations, ye ng'ayongera okwenyweza ng'akozesa ensimbi ezo mu kwenywereza mu ntebe ng'akola buli kikolobero, naye nga America ezibako eriiso limu ng'eraga nti tebiraba. Bino nno Kyagulanyi Bobi Wine yabadde agamba nti obwo bwe bunnanfuusi bwe bukuusa bwe butali bwenkanya eggwanga lya America bye bulaga eri Africa, nti ye kasiteeba America ng'efunamu ejja kukolagana n'atali mu mateeka efune kyeyagala, naye ate erekewo abo abali mu mateeka, erekewo ab'eddembe ejjeo abo abakozesa effujjo. Nti Mwami Museveni bwe yanajja mu ntebe yajja na ffujjo, yajja na kutta, naye ate Abamerika gwe bawagira. Kati ate mmwe abajja n'eddembe muleetewo demokrasiya mu Uganda, nti mmwe ebasindika eri, kubanga yo ekolagana na muntu so si na nsi. Ekolagana na Mwami Museveni ng'omuntu, babamanyi ye ajja batuusiza oba ajja bakolera ebyabwe bye baagala. Nga singa agaana nga bamugamba tugenda kujja ku ntebe, kati aba alina okutuukiriza bo byakola ki bye beetaaga. Naye ne Mwami Museveni n'abategeera, n'amanya nti abazungu bano baagala ki, Abamerika bano baagala ki, n'alondangayo eyo ensonga emu, nti balwanyisa abatujju, balwanyisa Al-Shabaab, balwanyisa Al-Qaeda, balwanyisa Islamic State, n'akyetuuma nti abatujju ba Al-Qaeda, abatujju ba Al-Shabaab, abatujju ba Islamic State bannumba, bannwanyisa nange kuba nkolagana nani n'Amerika. Kati Amerika neraba Museveni nga munywanyi waayo bwe bali mu kulwanyisibwa bombi. N'olwekyo netandika kumuwa byakulwanyisa nsimbi alwanyise abatujju abo, ate ng'olusobola awo tebali nayo. Naye nga just yamanya kye baagala n'atandika okukola ekyo. Bo nawe namulabanga munnaabwe ne basigala nga bamuwagira. Kati kiggwe Munnayuganda, gwe mwana wa Afrika, ky'olina okukola okutaasa ebyo byonna okulaba nti biggwawo era bivaawo, tubeere n'ensi ennungi, nga oli sure nti enkya ne bwe nnaba siriiwo abaana bange bajja kubeera mu nsi nga yeeyagaza, okusinga okuba kugamba olaba nze bibadde bwe biti ate bwe sibeewo, lwaki siva e Uganda ne ngenda mu America. Ti abantu bakola immigrations eziri illegal lwakuba nti beewonya ekibambulira ekiri mu nsi zaabwe. Naye ng'ate ekibambulira ekyo America yekiteekayo, ekolagana ne bannakyemalira, ne bawa buli kimu, ne bawa ensimbi, ne banyigiriza abantu mu nsi zaabwe, abantu ne beenyiwa nga beetaaga okufunako relief, nga kye balina okukola kudduka kuva mu mawanga gaabwe bagende mu America. Kati kino koma America erina okukomya okuwa bannakyemalira ensimbi, neegamba nti bw'oba nga tokoze ABCD tewali ssente. Naye bo bazibibwa amaaso, bannakyemalira babazannya 1, 2, 3 pre ne baziba amaaso ne babazannya omuzannyo ne bakolagana nabo nti Africa terina ngeri gyegenda kukulamu, olunaku terujja kukya na lumu nga ensimbi z'omuzungu zikyajja mu bannakyemalira, nti kuba tewali alina maanyi gasobola kulwanyisa nsimbi ya muzungu. Tusobola kulwana na ddoola ya America n'omalako, tusobola kulwana na byakulwanyisa bya America n'omalako, wabula olina kukozesa emirembe. Ne America n'ekuyambako n'egamba bannakyemalira tubakooye bakome, n'ekomya okubawa ensimbi. Kino Bobi Wine akiise nti funding our operation, funding our death, our killing, funding our torture. Nti America sente azikwata n'afundinga okuttibwa kw'omwana w'omuddugavu, n'afundinga badikiteeta basobole okutulugunya omwana w'omuddugavu, ate ye n'atabifaako nga tebimukwatako. Nti kati gwe omwana wa Africa gw'osigaza obuvunaanyizibwa okulaba nga webbulula, kuba kimanye oli ku lulwo, abazungu abo tebakuliiko, bali ku byabwe, bafa ku bigendererwa byabwe, tebafa ku ddembe lya buntu, human rights, ebyo babinyumyako binyumya. Ne in reality si bye baliko, bali ku kiki bayisaawo olwaleero okutuukiriza kye baagala, goolo yaabwe eno n'eno, ki ekigenda okubayamba bo kye batunuulira. Oba bakolagana na dictator, oba bakolagana na mutemu, oba bakolagana na musezi, bo they don't mind. Bafa ku kintu kimu, nti ono anaatuyisaawo wano, anaatubuusa bridge eno, bwe tubeera n'ono tunaafuna golodi okuva e Congo, tunaafuna amafuta okuva e Uganda, bwe tukolagana n'ono tunaafuna kokowa okuva ewano ne wano. Bo nga balina ebyabwe bye baagala, bakozesa oyo baaliwo mu bumenyi bw'amateeka ne bamukozesa kubanga balina bwe bamukwatira nabo, nti singa ogezaako okwogera, singa ogezaako okugaana nga tukkanga tugenda kujja mu ntebe oli mu bumenyi bw'amateeka. ati ne bamuzannyira awo naye n'abazannyira awo ng'omwana w'omuddugavu n'obonaabona ne weenyuwa mu nsi yo nga tumanyi na future ya nsi yo egenda kubeera enkya kubanga buli ensi ebeeramu bannakyemalira era tesobola kubayo mirembe mu maaso. Olunaku ne bwafuga atya, olunaku lukya lumu ebintu ne bifuuka wabeerawo okuyiwa musaayi abantu ne bafa naye nga lwayiye ku lwawo. So singa abanga yawummula ebyo tebibaawo. Ono bw'avaako n'addawo n'avaako nga yateekawo system eri environmental friendly eri people friendly nga buli muntu ajja kwesimbawo nga bw'ayagala nga buno obusobozi bwe buli alondebwe oba agaanibwe eggwanga litambule ligende mu maaso. Nobeera naawe ng'oli sure ku nkya y'enkya nti Uganda oba Africa enkya ejja kuba bweti ejja kuba egenda mu maaso noba ng'omanyi naye kati tewali amanyi byakubaatisa bubaatisa oba tonna batulyawo ng'ate Museveni bamulumbye ne bamukuba atotalo ne lujja oba tonna batulyawo ate nga Kagame bamulumbye ne bamukuba nga tulimu eyo embeera tuli sure ku tomorrow. Kati nno eyo embeera nti tulina okugyerwanyisa ffe abaana ba Africa nga tugamba ku bazungu abo bakomye okufandinga bannakyemalira, bakomye okufandinga okuttibwa kwaffe, bakomye okufandinga okutulugunyizibwa kwaffe, bakomye okufandinga obumbula, okugobwa ku mataka, okubonaabona k'omwana wa Africa. Naye nga ffe tulina obbateeka ku pressure nga tulabisa ebituufu ebiri munda mu mawanga gaffe nga twanika amazima amatuufu agagenda mu maaso mu nsi zaffe nga situtiitira kwogera wabula nga twogera amazima nti ABCD bino bye biri mu Africa era bisaanidde okukoma era nti America sebo komya okuwa bannakyemalira ensimbi, komya okusasulira okufa kwaffe, komya okusasulira okutulugunyizibwa kwaffe, komya okusasulira okubba akalulu mu Africa, komya okututeekako bannakyemalira. Mbaagala nnyo program bwetyo bwebadde eya leero. Omukama nsaba abankuumire. Mweraba.